Prime ministers, presidents, and other world leaders gathered in New York City for the 79th session of the United Nations General Assembly. The halls of the UN, usually abuzz with diplomatic maneuvering, took on a sense of urgency this year. The world is grappling with multiple crises, but none were as poignant, as emotionally charged as the unfolding humanitarian disaster in Gaza. War in Gaza was one of the issues that topped the agenda of speeches, and the General Assembly became a platform for global leaders to voice their condemnation, their pleas, and their proposals for a path forward. From the soaring rhetoric to the thinly veiled frustrations, the speeches reflected the deep divisions and the immense challenges in finding a resolution to this decades-long conflict. This is a conflict that has claimed the lives of thousands, displaced countless more, and left the region teetering on the brink. We're about to hear from the world leaders themselves, their words, carrying the weight of their nations, their hopes and their fears.
The gravity of the situation in Gaza is starkly evident. The speed and scale of the killing and destruction are unlike anything I've witnessed in my years as Secretary General. This is not just a diplomatic issue, it's a deeply human one. Over 200 UN staff members, many with their families, have been killed in Gaza. These individuals were dedicated to providing aid, offering a lifeline in a region gripped by conflict. Their deaths underscore the perilous environment and the human cost of this war. Gaza is a non-stop nightmare, and this conflict, if left unchecked, threatens to engulf the entire region. My appeal to the international community is unequivocal: an immediate ceasefire. Not tomorrow, not next week, but now. The release of all hostages is a non-negotiable demand to end the agonizing uncertainty for those held captive. And finally, we must begin an irreversible process towards a two-state solution. The only way out of this cycle of violence is through a just and lasting peace. The situation in Gaza and the West Bank is one of the greatest humanitarian crises in recent history. The conflict's alarming spread to Lebanon further destabilizes a region already grappling with volatility. The human toll is devastating. Over 40,000 fatalities, most of whom are women and children. This conflict has ripped through families and communities indiscriminately. In a pointed critique, I question the very notion of self-defense, suggesting that it has morphed into something far more sinister, a right to revenge. This is the obstacle preventing a ceasefire, a barrier to the release of hostages, a roadblock to any hope of peace. The international community must find a way to break this cycle before it consumes the region entirely.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's speech was a potent mix of outrage and sorrow, his words echoing with the cries of those trapped in the conflict. He painted a horrifying picture of Gaza as the largest cemetery for children and women in the world, a testament to the devastating toll on innocent lives. The statistic he shared, over 17,000 children targeted by Israeli bullets and bombs, landed like a punch to the gut, a stark reminder of the human cost of this conflict. President Erdogan didn't shy away from placing blame, his words a direct challenge to the international community's conscience. His speech was punctuated by a series of rhetorical questions, each one designed to expose what he saw as the hypocrisy of the world's response to the crisis. Are those in Gaza and the occupied West Bank not human beings? Do children in Palestine have no rights? He asked, his voice filled with anguish. President Erdogan went further, accusing the West of abandoning its own values, claiming that the values the West claims to defend are dying. He lamented the death of truth and the fading hope for a just world. His words were a scathing indictment of the international community's perceived inaction in the face of suffering. President Erdogan's speech was a powerful reminder of the human cost of this conflict, a call to action for a world that seems to have grown accustomed to the images of violence and despair. His words, though harsh, reflected the raw emotions of many watching the crisis unfold, a desperate plea for justice and a recognition of the shared humanity of those caught in the crossfire.
King Abdullah II of Jordan's address to the UN General Assembly was a stark and sobering assessment of a world seemingly locked in a perpetual state of crisis. His words, measured and heavy with the weight of responsibility, painted a picture of a global order teetering on the brink. "I cannot recall a time of greater peril than this," he stated, his words echoing through the hall. The king's somber observation wasn't merely hyperbole. It was a reflection of the interconnected crises gripping the world, From the ongoing conflict in Gaza to the rise of global tensions and the looming threat of climate change, King Abdullah didn't mince words when he addressed the situation in Gaza, pointing to the failure of the international community to protect innocent civilians. He spoke of the sky-blue flag of the UN, a symbol of hope and protection, rendered meaningless in the face of relentless bombardment. His words cut to the heart of the matter, the erosion of trust in the UN's founding principles. The king argued that the world was witnessing a dangerous trend, the selective application of international law and the bending of global justice to the will of the powerful. King Abdullah's address was a potent reminder of the fragility of peace and the urgent need for a renewed commitment to multilateralism and a rules-based international order. His words, though delivered with a king's composure, carried a sense of urgency, a plea for collective action before the world descends further into chaos.
Colombian President Gustavo Petro's speech took aim at the heart of what he saw as the root cause of global conflict, the unchecked power of a wealthy elite. He didn't shy away from naming them, the richest 1% of humanity, the powerful global oligarchy, and directly linked their pursuit of power to the suffering in Gaza, Lebanon, and Sudan. President Petro's words were a searing indictment of a global system that he argued prioritizes profit over people, a system where the ability to wage war and inflict suffering has become the true measure of power. His speech was a stark reminder that the consequences of this power imbalance are felt most acutely by the most vulnerable. He lamented the silencing of voices from the global south, voices that represent the majority of humanity but are often ignored on the world stage. He pointed to the hypocrisy of a system that claims to uphold democracy and human rights while turning a blind eye to the plight of the oppressed. President Petro's speech was a call to action, a rallying cry for a more just and equitable world order. He challenged the legitimacy of a system that allows a powerful few to dictate the fate of the many, a system that prioritizes destruction over diplomacy and profits over peace. His words, though delivered from the grand stage of the UN General Assembly, resonated with the struggles of marginalized communities around the world, communities fighting for their voices to be heard, for their humanity to be recognized, and for a world where their lives and their futures are valued.
The Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, used his platform at the UN to deliver a blunt and searing critique of the ongoing crisis in Gaza, calling the situation not a peace process, but genocide. His words, echoing with frustration and a sense of urgency, cut through the diplomatic veneer often characteristic of such gatherings. The Emir's speech was a stark reminder of the long and painful history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a conflict he argued was rooted in the absence of a genuine political will to find a just solution. He placed the blame squarely on the shoulders of the international community, accusing them of deliberate inaction and a failure to hold the occupying power accountable. He went further, stating that there was no Israeli partner for peace during the current government's tenure, a bold statement that underlined the deep mistrust and animosity that has come to define the relationship between the two sides. The Emir didn't mince words when he spoke of the plight of the Palestinian people, highlighting their right to self-determination as non-negotiable, not a gift to be bestowed by outside actors. His words were a clear message to those who continue to advocate for a peace process devoid of justice and genuine equality. In a scathing critique of the UN Security Council, he lamented its failure to implement its own ceasefire resolution and criticized its inaction on granting Palestine full membership status. His words laid bare the frustrations of many who view the UN as failing to live up to its own ideals and its responsibility to protect. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa's address to the UN General Assembly was a powerful and poignant reminder of his country's own struggle against apartheid. He drew a direct parallel between the oppression faced by black South Africans and the current plight of the Palestinian people, labeling the situation in Gaza a grim continuation of a system designed to dehumanize and subjugate. President Ramaphosa's words carried a moral weight few other leaders could muster. He spoke not from a place of theoretical solidarity, but from the lived experience of a nation that had endured decades of systematic discrimination and violence.
We South Africans know what apartheid looks like. We lived through it. We suffered and died under it.
His words were a chilling reminder of the human cost of indifference and inaction in the face of oppression. President Ramaphosa's decision to invoke the term apartheid was a deliberate and powerful statement. It was a direct challenge to the international community, a call to action for those who claim to stand for justice and equality.
Silence in the face of injustice is complicity. The lessons learned from South Africa's struggle must not be forgotten.
He concluded his address by highlighting South Africa's legal challenge against Israel in the International Court of Justice, a testament to his government's commitment to holding perpetrators of injustice accountable. President Ramaphosa's speech was a powerful reminder that the fight for freedom and equality transcends borders and generations, and that the world has a moral obligation to stand with those who are denied their fundamental human rights. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian's address to the UN General Assembly was a searing indictment of Israel's actions in Gaza, accusing the Israeli government of carrying out a deliberate and systematic campaign of violence against the Palestinian people. His words, delivered with a mix of anger and sorrow, laid bare the deep divisions that continue to plague the region.
The situation in Gaza is genocide. The Israeli regime has murdered over 41,000 innocent people, mostly women and children, in cold blood.
His words, though inflammatory to some, reflected the raw emotions of many in the region who view Israel's actions as disproportionate and unjustified. He condemned what he saw as the Israeli government's attempts to justify its actions under the guise of self-defense, calling it a cynical attempt to whitewash the suffering inflicted upon the Palestinian people.
They label genocide as self-defense. This is nothing but a cynical attempt to whitewash the suffering of the Palestinian people.
His words highlighted the vast chasm that exists between the narratives presented by both sides, a chasm that seems to only widen with each passing day. President Pezeshkian also addressed the issue of global perception, accusing Israel and its allies of weaponizing accusations of anti-Semitism to silence criticism of Israeli policies.
Legitimate concerns about the treatment of Palestinians are being unfairly labeled as bigotry, effectively stifling debate and hindering efforts to find a just solution to the conflict.
His speech, though delivered from a position of deep opposition to Israel, highlighted the urgent need for the international community to address the root causes of the conflict and to hold all parties accountable for their actions. President Pezeshkian's words served as a reminder that true peace cannot be achieved through violence or oppression, but through dialogue, understanding, and a genuine commitment to justice and equality for all. Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo's address to the UN General Assembly struck a different tone, focusing on the need for concrete action to address the escalating violence in the Middle East. He acknowledged the long and troubled history of the conflict, but argued that the time for rhetoric had passed and that the international community must move beyond condemnation and towards meaningful solutions.
The dehumanization of the enemy is a key driver of this conflict. Decades of demonization and mistrust have created a vicious cycle of violence that has claimed the lives of over 40,000 people in less than a year.
His words served as a reminder that true peace requires empathy and understanding, even for those we may view as adversaries. He criticized both sides for their lack of respect for international humanitarian law, but reserved his harshest criticism for the disproportionate attack on Gaza that he argued showed a blatant disregard for Palestinian civilian life.
The disproportionate attack on Gaza shows a blatant disregard for Palestinian civilian life. This is unacceptable.
His words reflected the growing international concern over the high number of civilian casualties and the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza. Prime Minister De Croo reiterated his government's long-standing call for an immediate and lasting ceasefire, lamenting the fact that such a goal seemed more distant than ever.
We call for an immediate and lasting ceasefire. The entire region is at risk of being engulfed in violence if this conflict continues to escalate.
He warned that the entire region was at risk of being engulfed in violence if the conflict continued to escalate, highlighting the potential for a wider conflagration with devastating consequences. He concluded his address by emphasizing the importance of action over words, highlighting Belgium's decision to impose a weapons embargo on those involved in the conflict and reaffirming his country's commitment to providing humanitarian aid to those affected by the fighting.
Action speaks louder than words. Belgium has imposed a weapons embargo and remains committed to providing humanitarian aid to those affected by the fighting.
Prime Minister De Croo's speech was a call to action for the international community, urging them to move beyond words and towards concrete steps to end the violence and address the root causes of the conflict. The speeches delivered at the 79th session of the UN General Assembly painted a sobering picture of a world grappling with an intractable conflict. The raw emotions, the pointed accusations, the desperate pleas for peace, they all pointed to the immense challenges in finding a path forward in Gaza. The stories coming out of Gaza are heartbreaking. We've seen the images of devastation, the faces of grieving families. The human toll of this conflict is immeasurable. And yet, amidst the despair, there were glimmers of hope. World leaders, though divided in their approaches, seemed united in their recognition of the urgency of the situation. The question now is whether this sense of urgency will translate into concrete action. Will the world finally find the political will to break the cycle of violence and forge a just and lasting peace? The answer, as always, lies in the hands of those with the power to act. The world is watching, waiting, hoping.